Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome. We are so excited to have you with us for this great opportunity to learn and work together towards racial justice in multilingual education. My name is Kara Mitchell-Vieska, and I am an associate professor of teaching, learning, and teacher education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the PI of the ICME project. My pronouns are she, hers. Before we get started with the presentation tonight, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous land we are on and the Native American people who have always been here and still are. By doing this, we are seeking to honor our Indigenous neighbors, friends, and relatives for their important relationships to the land, but also to recognize and take ownership over our own story of colonization and taking a small part in undoing its legacy. Oh, sorry, I haven't moved the slides forward. So please participate in this land acknowledgement by naming in the chat the Indigenous land that you live and work on. The website native-land.ca can help you identify this information if you don't already know. ICME is at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, a land grant, also known as a land grab institution, with campuses and programs on past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee, Usnipanka, Otto-Missouria, Omaha, Dakota, Lakota, Arapaho, Kaw, Cheyenne, and Saulteaux peoples, as well as those of the relocated Ho-Chunk, the Winnebago, Bahoe, and Sac and Fox of Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. With this land acknowledgement, we affirm Native American sovereignty and commit to working in right relationship with our Native American relatives and neighbors, as well as with the land they were historically and continue to be protectors and stewards of. Thank you to everyone who posted in the chat. Please keep posting if you would like. We invite everyone to consider their place in the story of colonization and your responsibilities and opportunities to work towards Native American sovereignty and decolonization. So we are so pleased to be able to welcome you all tonight and to hear from our friend and colleague, Dr. Chris Leider. She's a clinical assistant professor of language education and the program director of bilingual education and TESOL licensure in the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. Dr. Leider is a dedicated and passionate teacher, lover of languages and traveler, as well as a fantastic skier, biker, dancer, foodie, and fashionista. Basically, she's not only smart and accomplished, but she's also really fun. Her life experiences are deeply important for her work, as she is a proud Filipino-American second-generation immigrant who was born and raised on an island in Alaska. We are so lucky to have her as our inaugural speaker in our Racial Justice Speaker Series. Thank you for being here with us tonight, Dr. Leider, and let's all welcome her in any way that suits you while you are muted on Zoom.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I love all the clapping emojis populating the Zoom screen. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Jessica, can you give me just a thumbs up that you can see my screen? All right. So thank you everyone for having me and for joining us this evening for the ICME Racial Justice Webinar Series. I'm really looking forward to spending the next hour with you all for this talk, Social Justice Education in the Multilingual Classroom, a Framework for Anti-Bias and Language-Rich Instruction. Thank you to those of you that filled out the little Google form in the chat sharing where you're from. I see that we have a lot of Nebraska and Massachusetts representation here. That makes sense given our host institutions, but it's also really cool to see folks from across the US present today. So thank you for joining us across multiple time zones. So I'd like to start by learning a bit about where you all might stand. So if you don't mind, if you could visit this website, menti.com, and you can use the code 8488795, and my colleague Jessica will also post it in the chat. But could you share a word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of social justice education? And as each of you share, you'll see a word cloud start to populate on the screen right in front of us. I see lots of things coming on the screen with equity right in the center, big and strong. That's really awesome. And I see access, fairness, community centering around that, inclusive, critical. I see youth activism, questioning, facing ourselves, lots of good things here. Thank you folks for sharing here. I will take a screenshot of this later to share it with everybody, but I'm really happy to see that equity is in the center and that we have access, inclusive, and fairness surrounding that. Because today, what I'm hoping we can do, I'm gonna move this forward, is these are our objectives. These are 2 objectives for our time together tonight. I can identify action items for developing anti-bias and accessible instruction for culturally and linguistically diverse students. And I can list specific actions that I will take in my curricular and instructional planning. So I know you're all here tonight because you're interested in social justice education or for multilingual learners. And you're probably wondering, okay, cool, I'm here, I'm ready. Now, where do I start? So with anything, when it comes to curriculum and instruction, we always start with our students. And so tonight in particular, I want to center culturally and linguistically diverse students. For those of us in the United States, culturally and linguistically diverse students represent a large and growing population in our schools. Recent data reports that 22% of children speak a language other than English at home, and 5 million of US public school students are classified as English learners. Globally, the world continues to experience an age of migration, with about 3% of its population moving out of their birth country during their lifetime. This increasing trend of long distance migration leads to more cultural and linguistic diversity in classrooms across the world. We know from research that pre-K through 12 classrooms are becoming increasingly multilingual spaces. And research has also suggested that teachers need better training for supporting culturally and linguistically diverse students in general. Now, knowing all this brings us to our very first action item, and that is to know your students. And I don't just mean their proficiency levels, but like really get to know them. What languages do they speak? What can you learn about their languages? What do you know about their home life? If they're migrants, what do you know about their birth country? If they are children of immigrants, what do you know about their parents' home country? For instance, let's meet Rita, and we'll meet Rita a lot tonight. Rita's a 7th grader. She speaks Spanish, Portuguese, and English. Rita's family is from Costa Rica, and they moved to the US in the middle of 6th grade. She did not study English before moving to the States, but she knows Spanish from growing up in Costa Rica and Portuguese because her father is from Brazil. Her favorite color is purple, and she is currently watching The Babysitter's Club on Netflix. She has a lot of friends who she loves to spend time with. Emily's her neighbor, and they play soccer together. Grace, like her, speaks Portuguese, and Clau's family is also from Costa Rica. Clau was born in the US and likes to speak in Spanish with Rita. Rita also likes to read books and articles about the rainforest and thinks frogs are pretty cool. Her favorite class is science, and She also really likes her social studies teacher, but she finds the content to be challenging because she is still learning a lot of US history. Now, think of just how much with this little bit of information we can use to really inform our instructional planning for Rita. What we know about Spanish and Portuguese languages can be useful in informing our language instruction. Knowing she's interested in reading about rainforests tells us not just her interests, but also that she likes expository and informational texts. Knowing she's watching the Babysitters Club gives us an insight into things to discuss with her informally and in passing. By the way, if you haven't seen it yet, the new Babysitters Club also has a lot of humanities and social justice references throughout the show, so it might be possible to connect some of that into her social studies content learning. So once we know who our students are, we need to draw from the ed research to really inform our work with them. And I'm going to flip this triangle over because the foundation of our work with culturally and linguistically diverse students comes from our education elders. From the early work of Dr. Sonia Nieto, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, and Dr. Geneva Gay, we know the importance of culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy. And as we all continue to have the privilege to learn from these critical scholars, recent scholars have continued to build on this early work. And I hope many of you are also familiar with the work of Dr. Django Paris, Dr. Bettina Love, and Dr. Goldie Muhammad. Now, here we have education scholars that have laid the foundation for what it means to do social justice work in our classrooms. Please note, this is not an exhaustive list. There's lots of badass scholars out there to learn from. And so that brings us to our next action item. If you haven't spent time reading this work, then something you should add to your action item list is to learn and unlearn. Learning about anti-racist pedagogical practices and unlearning racist and deficit ideas that we've ingrained over time is an important part of doing anti-racist work. Here's some stuff to get you started. And I really want to emphasize the importance of reading work by scholars of color. And if you have the means, please also purchase their books. Finally, I want to also remind you that this learning and unlearning, it's an ongoing process. Keep reading, keep discussing, and keep challenging yourself. Now, many of you here may already be at this stage where you're engaged in the reading and discussing this work and what it means for you as an educator, and you're wondering, okay, well, now what can I do with this information? So if we draw from the ideas represented in this work, then we can use that to inform a social justice-oriented curriculum. So let's take these ideas and work them into our instructional planning and develop justice-oriented curriculum. One tool that can be helpful in learning how to apply critical ideas we learn from ed research comes from teaching tolerance. For those of you new to teaching tolerance, they are a fabulous resource for educators. And while there are many resources available on their website, today I want to talk specifically about the teaching tolerance social justice standards. And my colleague Jessica will drop a link to those in the chat if you'd like to check them out right now. But these social justice standards, they were released in spring of 2017, and they're an anti-bias framework. Who's familiar with these? Can I get some thumbs up? You can use that feature in the chat, or not in the chat, sorry, the Zoom feature. All right, I see some thumbs up here. Who uses them already? Anyone? Thumbs up. Well, let's walk through them a bit. There's 20 standards distributed across the following 4 domains that include identity, diversity, justice, and action. The identity standards center around personal identity development. And when we take a closer look and think specifically about culturally and linguistically diverse students in particular, these standards can be especially empowering as our students learn about their linguistic resources and unlearn the values communicated to them about how their language and cultures are not valued or welcomed. The diversity standards focus on awareness and respect for diversity. And when we zoom in on these standards can be especially helpful for us as educators as we consider how we position the identities of our students and the rich diversity of identities and intersection of identities in our curriculum. Where the identity standards provide a framework for helping students develop a sense of pride for who they are, the diversity standards provide a framework for helping students value the identities and experiences of others.
Hey, Chris, just one second. Can you slow down your speech a little bit for our interpreters?
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Next, we have the justice standards, which focus on recognizing bias. Zeroing in on these standards, we see that the justice standards take a step beyond affirming a diversity to recognizing when difference is treated as negative and result in harmful and hateful injustice. And finally, we have the action standards. And when we dive into this final domain, we see that the action standards center on developing empathy and skills for responding to observed inequities and issues of injustice. I won't go into this deeply tonight, but I also wanted to highlight that the standards are broken into grade level clusters. Here you can see the grade 3 through 5 cluster. And each of these clusters include grade level outcomes, describing what each of these anchor standards can look like at the specific grade level clusters. And the last cool thing that you can find in the standards document that I want to point out is that the standards document also includes anti-bias examples that are developmentally appropriate for respective grade levels. When we return back to the ideas that we have learned from our education scholars, I think it's helpful to think of the work on being culturally responsive as largely guiding the identity and diversity standards. The identity and diversity standards emphasize appreciation for difference across multiple contexts. So we can use the identity standards to guide our instructional decisions on making sure our students have space and time to cultivate a strong sense of identity, and we can further use the diversity domain to guide our curricular decisions on materials, authors, and content. And we can think of the work that pushes us to think about how we can empower ourselves and our students to be agents of change as aligning with the justice and action domains, which highlight the multi-level and multifaceted nature of injustice and are more action-focused. So I think of these standards as a way to help us think more critically, with a capital C, about the activities, discussions, and outcomes that we have in our units and lessons. Now, we don't have a ton of time to dive into these in great detail tonight, but I wanted to share a few ways that we can use these standards, things that I hope you can do on your own really soon. So here's Rita again. Now remember, Rita likes science. She's watching the Babysitters Club. She's from Costa Rica. She's pretty cool. And remember, she also likes social studies. And here's her social studies teacher, Miss H. And Rita's social studies teacher, Miss H, is about to start a unit on the United Farm Workers and the Delano grape strike. So let's return to the social justice standards. One thing I find helpful with these standards is that they can help us focus on our social justice approach. We can really dive into one of the domains. For instance, Ms. H's upcoming unit on the grape strike could be well informed by the justice standards. Another approach is you could spiral this and select one standard from each domain to guide your unit planning. So here's a different approach where there's an identity, diversity, justice, and action focus for the entire unit. So Rita's teacher might use these to take a robust approach to unit planning, a justice-oriented curriculum. Now, Ms. H might work in a school where she can select and plan her own curriculum, but we know that not everyone works in a school where they may have that much choice. Ms. M, for example, works at a school where the curriculum is prescribed. In this situation, there are two ways that I think these standards can be especially helpful. Now, sometimes the curriculum we are expected to teach or draw from can be pretty cool. For instance, this plan from Facing History, which is about the Delano grape strike, is quite thoughtful. In this lesson plan, we have the essential question: how can people work together to raise their voices and demand the rights they have been denied? That's a great guiding question, and we can use that, and we can see that the lesson is going to have a justice-oriented lens. The lesson itself, while robust, is very justice and diversity focused, and the social justice standards can be a helpful framework to consider supplemental lessons or activities by also aligning it with an identity standard to connect this movement to our students, and also by aligning it with an action standard to perhaps get students to consider their own role in organizing and protests. So these standards can be useful in supplementing existing curriculum that is prescribed. And it's worth noting, though, that sometimes we have no say at all in the curriculum, and it might be completely prescribed at the schools that we work in. And living in the standards-driven era that we are in today, the very language of social justice standards can make this document actually useful to help advocate for change, as it aligns well with the curriculum and the Common Core standards or curriculum frameworks that your states might use. Another way we can use these standards is to guide our planning at the lesson level to develop social justice objectives. For instance, a social justice objective might focus on curriculum or content of the lesson, or it might specifically address the activities you will be doing in the lesson. They could also address student interaction. Now, I won't go into specifics about crafting social justice objectives tonight, but I wanted to share that in the upcoming future, there will be some sample lessons shared on our ICME website. And these lessons will include social justice objectives that are aligned with the Teaching Tolerant Social Justice standards. I want to just briefly share an example from one of the lessons that will be shared on the website. This lesson is by Eric Fishman, a former student of mine and current teacher in Massachusetts. He used this article from News ELA, and he had a content objective driven by the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks. For those of you outside of Massachusetts, you might be using Common Core or your respective state standards. He had language objectives driven by the WIDA English Language Development Standards. And he also used the social justice standards to develop social justice objectives. Notice how each of these objectives are cohesive and aligned to standards. I point this out again because I think we can use the language of standards to advocate for the use of social justice standards in tandem with other standards and curriculum framework. So here we have 4 concrete ways that you can use the social justice standards: robust approach to unit planning, supplementing existing curriculum, advocating for change in curriculum, and lesson level social justice objectives. If you're interested in learning more about these standards, Teaching Tolerance has professional development modules that you can go through with the cohort of your colleagues to learn more. My colleague Jessica will share that information in the chat, so you can click and have that for later. So far we've discussed 3 action items: know your students, learn and unlearn, and develop justice-oriented curriculum. Our focus tonight is social justice for the multilingual classroom. What else do we need to know? Share your ideas in the chat, please. All right, well, if we are focusing on social justice education for multilingual learners, language. If we got to consider equitable access for culturally and linguistically diverse students, and that means language. So directly in tandem with the research guiding our anti-bias approach, we have linguistically responsive pedagogical practices that meets the needs, our students' linguistic needs, an understanding of language learning and language development to inform our instructional decisions, and engaging in anti-racist TESOL practices, and taking a translanguaging stance, and general asset-based perspectives of multilingual learners. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. We have so many scholars that we can learn from. I want you to note that I'm very intentional tonight in especially highlighting the work of scholars of color. Now, in case you need to add some additional work to your learning and unlearning action item, and remember, this is an ongoing process, here's some additional badass women of color scholars and books to read. So just like with anti-racist pedagogy, maybe you're at the stage already where you're engaged in the reading and learning, and now you're wondering, okay, so now what? If we draw on education research on supporting culturally and linguistically diverse students, then we can use that to inform equitable access. So let's talk about how to take these ideas into our lesson planning so that we ensure equitable access to the anti-bias and social justice focused content that we will be teaching. Now, those of you joining us from Massachusetts are in a WIDA state, and those of you in Nebraska I know are not in a state that is a member of the WIDA consortium. And I know there's folks here joining from states that may or may not be WIDA states. Whether you're in a WIDA state or not, there's a lot of great resources that WIDA provides. One resource in particular that can be especially helpful are the WIDA can-do descriptors. Who uses these already to guide their instructional planning? Cool, I see some thumbs. Well, they're a really helpful resource. They're divided into grade level clusters and they're downloadable for free. My colleague Jessica will share the information in the chat there. So if you're new to WIDA, you can access the can-do descriptors at the link that was just dropped in the chat, and you'll see they're divided in these grade level clusters. Something that's helpful to note is the clusters that the WIDA can-do descriptors are divided into align pretty nicely with the clusters that the social justice standards are divided into, so they work really nicely together. So the can-do descriptors specify the kind of language that you would see at a particular grade level and in a particular grade level content classroom. They're geared towards the developmental stages and grade level content. Can-do descriptors focus on the student, and they specify how students at particular WIDA levels and grade level can use language. They help us understand what instructional supports our students need and how to differentiate. The WIDA can-do descriptors are divided into 4 key uses: recount, explain, argue, and discourse. Recount is about displaying knowledge or narrating experiences or events. Explain is where you have students clarify the why or how of ideas, actions, observations, or phenomena. Argue is where you have students make claims and support their claims with evidence. As we all know, one of the hardest things for us to get our students to do. And discusses where students interact and build meaning and share knowledge. Now, let's come back to Rita, who we met earlier. So remember, she likes science. Her favorite color is purple. She likes her social studies teacher. She likes social studies, although sometimes she finds the content challenging because of background knowledge. Now, one thing we didn't learn about Rita yet is that she's currently classified at the WIDA level 2. And note that the grade 6 through 8 can-do descriptors are what we have up on the screen, and we're using those specifically because they correspond to Rita, who is in middle school. In her social studies class, you may remember that they are currently learning about the United Farm Workers and the Delano grape strike. Rita's class is now doing a mini project where they have to make a protest sign that a key figure might have used in the Delano grape strike and explain their decision in what they put on their sign. Their sign can include images and words. Rita has chosen to make a sign for Larry Itlung, a Filipino-American activist and organizer who organized with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Let's focus specifically on the part of orally explaining her protest sign. The first thing you need to do is ask yourself, okay, what kind of task is this? Explain is where we have students clarify the why or how of ideas, actions, observations, or phenomena. So this would be our key use for this particular activity, as she's going to need to justify her decisions and explain what she chose to put on her protest sign. Now, here are the can-do descriptors for explain, and you'll see that they're divided into the language domains. So we have speaking, listening, reading, and writing. For those of you seeing these for the first time, you'll see at the top that they're also organized by level, and that refers to the WIDA English proficiency levels. So let's focus specifically on Rita's explanation of her protest sign. So we can ask ourselves, all right, does she need speaking, listening, reading, or writing to complete the task? And we know since she's explaining the sign to her classmates that it's going to be speaking. Finally, we zoom in on the student's English language proficiency level so we can see what they can do and then use that information to determine how we will differentiate and support. So we know that Rita is currently classified at the English language proficiency level 2. And so we can see that she can connect two content related ideas that define how or why and describe situations from modeled sentences. Now, based on this, I can see that Rita might benefit from a really structured model of how to explain her sign, maybe some sentence frames that she can use when explaining her sign, and some prompting to further connect more ideas. So here we have Rita, and here's her sign. It says, strike together, isang basak. And since we know students like Rita can describe situations from modeled sentences, she would benefit from a really clear model of what to say when explaining her sign. For example, here's her teacher and her teacher's sign. And here's what her teacher might say. Here is my sign. My sign is made by Dolores Huerta. I wrote Women for Justice because I know she did a lot of work, not just for the grape strike, but also for women. And I put the Spanish phrase that we read she used. And maybe also providing some sentence frames can further help Rita in her presentation. Here's some, for example. On my sign, I wrote, my sign is by, I wrote, because. And Rita might use these to describe her sign and provide a reason to explain her sign and the phrase isang basak. Maybe she says something like, my sign says strike together and isang bagsak. My sign is by Larry Itlog, who was a Filipino American. Maybe you remember he was friends with Dolores Huerta. I wrote this because that is a Filipino saying, and he is Filipino. And with prompting, Miss H might encourage her to build on that idea. Can you tell us what isang basak means? And with that prompt, we can see Rita further elaborate and use even more language. I think it was maybe everyone together. And with even more prompting, Miss H might encourage her to build on that idea and connect even more ideas. Is that why you wrote strike together? And you can see Rita do just that. Yes, because he also worked together with others. So just to cycle back to this, you can see again how Miss H drew from the can-do descriptors to inform her decisions on how to support Rita in using the English language to explain her sign and further elaborate on her ideas. Pretty cool, right? So I just want to return back to this slide from the start of our time together. Now, in the last half hour-ish, we've learned two tools that can be helpful in supporting culturally and linguistically diverse students. We learned how to use the teaching tolerant social justice standards to inform an anti-bias pedagogical approach to social justice-oriented curriculum. And we learned how to use some of the can-do descriptors, how they can be a tool in ensuring equitable access in our instructional planning. And it's only when we have social justice and equity at the base and our students in the center that we can really have classroom instruction that is grounded in access and social justice. So as we start to wind down, I want to close by having us remember that education is never neutral and should empower students to engage in and change society for better. And if we think about what this really means for our role as educators, we really need to think about who is at the center of our instructional planning. It should always be our students. Know our students first. And what is at the foundation of what we're doing? Our curriculum should be justice oriented, and we need to always be thinking of access. These aren't afterthoughts. These are the foundation of the work that we're doing. Because students notice what is and is not present in the classroom, right? When it comes to curriculum and instruction, our students are much more aware than I think we sometimes give them credit for. They notice what's there and what's not there. For our multilingual learners and for our migrant students, this means the languages and cultures seen, used, heard, and welcomed. For students of color, this means seeing themselves in the curriculum. We really need to ask ourselves, if our classes are extremely US centric, what does that communicate to our students? If we only teach in English and read whitewashed versions of history, what does that communicate to our students? If we don't address the society and politics, what does that communicate? If we don't address social inequities in the classroom, then we are teaching students to ignore justice. For our white kids and kids with from more privileged backgrounds in the classroom, we're communicating that it's okay to not pay attention and to not speak up. And for our Black, Indigenous, and students of color, for students with migrant backgrounds, for students who don't have easy access to basic needs or who are separated from their families, or who feel like their identities and multiple identities are not welcomed or acknowledged, we are stating that their experiences don't matter. And our students also notice if we don't ensure equitable access to the curriculum. If we have units on social change movements and our white monolingual and English proficient students can easily access the content, but we don't do the work to make it accessible for our multilingual learners, then we're literally telling them the power to make change is not for them. What is the point of badass social justice content if our students can't access it, learn from it, and build on it to be forces of change? So when our lessons are not equitably accessible, we communicate that the injustices they observe and experience do not matter. And if we want a more socially just world, then we have an obligation to engage in justice-oriented curriculum that is accessible for all learners, where our students are at the center of everything we do, and justice and equitable access are at the foundation of our instructional planning. So with that, I want to return to our session objectives. I can identify action items for developing anti-bias and accessible instruction for culturally and linguistically diverse students. And I can list specific actions I will take in my curricular and instructional planning. Okay, are you ready? Are you ready? All right, what specific actions will you take in your curricular and instructional planning? I want to take this moment now. If you feel comfortable, I'd love to see your ideas. What are some concrete specific actions that you will take? Please share them at this Mentimeter link. Jessica will drop it in the chat. And once you go there, you can share some specific action plans that you might plan to take based on some of the things we learned today. Yeah, use the standards. For those of you that are here with your colleagues, you could think about also maybe visiting some of these teaching tolerance modules on the standards and maybe going through some of that work together on how to use them. I see folks also talking about using the we to can do descriptors. taking the time to really get to know their students, please do. Our students are amazing and awesome and funny. I'm seeing lots of great ideas. Keep them coming. Awesome. I see a lot of things around representation, also working with colleagues, seeing so many great ideas here. I want to thank you all for sharing. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for joining us tonight. If you'd like to keep in touch, please feel free to email me. And you can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. On Twitter, I tweet about education. On Instagram, I do that and also share things that I'm eating. So if you like food, that's a good thing to follow. With that, I wanted to open it up for questions. I wanted to save time if folks wanted to ask questions or engage a bit. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Biesca.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leider. First of all, a big applause. Thank you so much for your great work. This was a really wonderful presentation. And shared a lot of great ideas. So we do have a question already in the chat that I thought I'd start with, actually two, and then I'll invite people to add more questions to the chat as you might have them. The first one is people are wondering about access to your slides and presentation. I forgot to talk about that with you in advance.
Oh, yes, I am happy to make some slides into a handout that, that I'm happy to share with folks.
We could post it to our website. So maybe, Jessica, you could make sure everyone has a link to our website. And if you come back in a couple days, you can get the handouts that Dr. Leider will put together for this. We're also recording this so that you can rewatch the presentation as well. And we are working on sharing some of these curated lesson plans that are examples of integrating the social justice standards with language development work. So. Then another question is, these strategies are very individualized. How do we do this for 30 students in a manageable way?
That's a great question. I think the first thing to remember is that collaboration is really important, right? We can't do this work on our own, and we shouldn't. I think especially as ESL teachers, we're often isolated and sometimes working on our own, which it shouldn't and doesn't have to be that way. One thing I think that can be helpful for those of you in WIDA states in particular is WIDA creates a shared language around talking about and supporting our students. And so those of you that are in WIDA states, even if you're not, meeting with other teachers, like literally with the can-do descriptors to talk about where your students are. One of the tools that will be on the same website page where you can download the can-do descriptors are the can-do name charts. I've worked with a whole bunch of teachers who use those to put their students' names into where they are, which can be really helpful when you're meeting with their other content teachers. So that's one thing I have to say is collaboration, I think, is just really, really key and important. The other is, the first action item that we talked about is really getting to know your students. The better we know our students, the more we're going to know what works for them and who will work well together in the instruction that we're doing, right? The more we know our students, the better we can do our grouping of students, the better we can target mini lessons, the better we can talk to our colleagues who also work with the same students about work that they're doing. I really hope one of the things you can think about is how can I take the work that I'm doing and collaborate and share with others. That I think is just key in everything. So that's a small bit of it, but I promise doing that makes a big difference. Um,
But
what else?
this is the real challenge, right? We
Mhm.
have these super diverse classrooms, and how do we create the context for meaningful learning for each student? And there are a lot of approaches that can be more helpful than thinking of the whole classroom together, like Dr. Leader was talking about. And maybe we'll do a webinar on some of those. So another question is, how would you recommend teachers facilitate conversations with school staff, parents, and community stakeholders around anti-racist work in the classroom?
So great question. My first thing I would say is do it. Make sure you have those conversations. But in all seriousness, I know that it can be challenging and that there can be resistance, right? I think one of the things that I'll say first is I think teaching tolerance was quite smart in how they designed the standards and that they call them standards, right? So that within itself, which is kind of silly that we have to attach a word like standards to it to make it seem more quote unquote like credible. But I do think that that helps, right? Because they align very well with Common Core. They even use the same language, anchor standards, domains, and they're clustered like the WIDA can-do descriptors are. So they work in tandem that way. So that's one thing I'd encourage you, to think about, is that the second is people are always going to be afraid of change, right? Because you're comfortable and it can be scary to have to be in a different place. And I think that's especially important to think about for those of you that might work in what have been historically low incidence districts, like you haven't had as many multilingual learners or migrant students in your district, and in the last few years the population might have exploded quite quickly. I think about where I live now in Massachusetts. I know some districts that, just 10 years ago had less than 5% classified English learners, and now they have like around 20%, right? That's rapid growth. You're talking big change really quickly in a place that had been relatively homogenous for a long time, right? So there's a lot of things that have to change. One is the work that our teachers are doing, right? We have to modify and adapt and be responsive to our students, and that can be hard for the population that's always had things that are the same, right? It can be really uncomfortable to all of a sudden feel like somebody else's needs are being prioritized over yours when like literally what we're doing is making everything accessible, right? And so I would encourage you to approach it from a standpoint of it's necessary, right? And we want to be fair and equitable in all of what our students have access to. And so that's what we're doing. One of the things for those of you here that are relatively new teachers, I think some of the biggest advice I can give you is find people in your building and or district that align themselves with your perspectives and ideas, right? They're your allies, they're your support. They're the people you can go to when you say, hey, I want to add an additional text to this text that I have to use to show multiple perspectives. Do you have suggestions for how to navigate that? Right? I personally think it's great to have somebody in your building that you can be an ally with you, and somebody in your district but outside of your building if it's possible, because they understand your district but aren't like living in the same place that you are, which can sometimes make things feel a little more comfortable to talk with them about. So there's that. Yes, those of you first year teachers in the middle of a pandemic, I can't imagine. That's a lot of things you're trying to change, right? You're trying to change, like adapt your instruction for your students, advocate that your classified English learners are getting the instruction that they are legally entitled to. Don't forget that, right? And finding folks to support you. That's where really finding allies and veteran teachers that are aligned with your own beliefs are really important.
I think we can always understand racial justice work to be collaborative coalition work, right? No one can do it on their own. So I think that's such a great recommendation. A follow-up to that question is something that, is specifically about how school support staff of color support teachers, specifically white teachers, in this work with their students of color. What advice might you have around that?
So supporting, I want to make sure that I heard that correctly, Dr. Vieska, supporting white people with
So,
privileged
yeah,
backgrounds on doing the work.
yeah, as a person of color.
So what I'm going to say, as a person of color myself, it's exhausting. But I know that it's necessary. So I have two things to say. One is we are experts because it's our lived experience. That doesn't obligate us to be your teachers. And I know that that can be hard to hear. I love working with my white colleagues around things, of injustice and having hard conversations with them. But I would encourage you to remember that just because we're people of color doesn't mean that that's our job. And I think that that's really important, especially as districts can work on like diversifying their teacher body, right? As you bring more diverse teachers into your pipeline and into your faculty, that's fantastic. They're great resources, they're strong. Remember that what they need as well, right? And so my advice to you on that is ask for recommendations, ask for support. Also ask, am I asking too much? Right? And ask like, what would you like to see me do? Right? Ask them that as well. The other thing I want to say is just because we're people of color doesn't mean that we don't have unlearning to do too. So for those of you in leadership positions, I think a lot of times anti-racist work is centered around the needs of white people. And let's remember that, I'm Asian American and there's a lot of anti-Blackness in my community that I need to fight and work on, right? And I need support for that as well. So remembering the way we think about differentiation for our students, we need to think about that as well when we're talking about professional learning and development.
Such important ideas. I think in education, we're really passionate and dedicated to our work. And in some ways, we are too easily to exploit because of that, right? So like being really careful about that is really great. So another question is, what systematic structural changes do you believe need to be made in order for teachers to be able to do this work better and more frequently?
I'd like to overhaul teacher education. So like, if I were queen of the world, I actually don't want that job. But if I were, we would overhaul it. We, just like in our K-12 schools, we haven't changed a lot in the way that we do education from when only privileged white men went to school. Right? Like it looks different, but not drastically different, but the population of students has drastically changed, right? And so we see that in our teacher prep, as well. So like my first things are, those of you that are teacher educators, who are you reading? What are you centering? Like what are we learning? We tend to teach, speaking of a standards-based era, like Common Core standards first, right? And then WIDA, if you're in a WIDA state, and then the teaching tolerant social justice standards. Flip that, right? Teach the teaching tolerant social justice standards first, center justice at the beginning, right? And then learn about what students need linguistically, right? And then let's talk about how we can use that to inform our instruction. I think that's the big thing, is thinking about the different ways that we talk about education, we teach education to folks. We really also need to make access to teaching more accessible for students from historically marginalized backgrounds. Like, I'll own the fact that I teach at BU. That's not a cheap institution, right? something that my institution could do to be better is to have more scholarships and funding available for students of color who want to be teachers of color, things like that. I think that there's ways like that we could start to address issues like that.
Another question is, do you think that considering a future career in higher ed teacher education programs would be a more effective way to create these changes as opposed to being a K-12 classroom teacher?
That's a great question and something I think about every day. Um, I think that we need both. We really do need both. Students, something to think about is we know that our teaching force is largely white, female, right? Like in the United States, native English, often monolingual speakers, right? That's not reflective of many of our students. And so, I think one, we do need more diverse teachers. And when I say diverse, I mean linguistically, culturally, racial, like all kinds of backgrounds. But we also need that in teacher ed. Personally, growing up as a Filipino American in Alaska, which is very cool, the first time I had an Asian American teacher ever in my life who was a woman was when I was in graduate school, right? Like I waited 25 years for that. And so we need more people that that share our backgrounds in teacher prep, just as much as we need them in the K-12 teaching field.
We all have so much potential and power in our realms of influence, but sometimes we can put our abilities to use in different realms of influence, right? So encourage everyone to be as expansive and thoughtful about how you can impact the world. So I'm looking at the time and we've had our hour together. So grateful, Dr. Leider, for your time and brilliance. We are going to post this video online, and with the link that Jess posted earlier, she can post it potentially again to our website with additional resources. We also plan to have additional racial justice webinar series probably in a couple of months, focusing really on how we can do racial justice work specifically with multilingual students and multilingual populations. So please keep an eye on that, and we'll heavily saturate social media with any advertisement about it. I also want to thank our ASL interpreters today. It's been phenomenal to work with them. We're so grateful for their presence. And also our team members at ICME who helped make all of this possible, setting up things, working on the closed captioning and everything like that. So thank you so much. A big applause and great gratitude to Dr. Leider. Thank you so much for your excellent work. We're so grateful. And please check our website for follow-up information with the video and handouts.